You see, we brought out 3 volumes of the 5th assessment report. The 4th one is due to come out by the end of October. But the major findings that we have in these 3 working group reports, as they are called, are firstly that there is more than a 95% probability that most of the warming that has taken place since the middle of the last century is the result of increase in concentration of greenhouse gases resulting from human activities. So we are responsible for the change in climate that has taken place since the middle of the last century. Another fact that we brought out is that the last 3 decades, each successive decade has been warmer than the previous one. In this three-decade period of 1983 to 2012 has been the warmest since the last 1400 years. If you look at sea level rise since the beginning of the last century up to 2010, the sea level has risen by 19 centimeters on average. Increase in temperature has been 0.85 degrees Celsius. And if you look at projections for the future, if we don't limit the concentration of greenhouse gases, then by the end of the century, we could get sea level rise as high as 98 centimeters. We could get temperature increase as high as 4.8 degrees Celsius. So that is clearly unacceptable. But this is a problem that we cannot allow to reach the levels that would occur if we don't take any action. So why should we be concerned about climate change? Well, if we don't do anything to limit the emissions of greenhouse gases, if we don't stabilize the concentration of these gases in the atmosphere, then the impacts of climate change, of course, will be there in the form of sea level rise, as I mentioned. They would certainly be there on human health, because climate change can be very harmful for human health, simply because while the climate is changing, extreme events are also increasing in frequency and intensity, particularly heat waves and extreme precipitation events. That means very heavy rainfall in a short period of time. Heat waves can be very harmful not only for the health of people, but they could also lead to mortality. You remember in 2003, there was a major heat wave in Europe and tens of thousands of people died. Also, there'll be an increase in vector-borne diseases because, with a changed climate, some of these carriers of disease will thrive, will multiply. So as a result, vector-borne diseases will increase. I also want to mention that the impacts on water resources could be negative. We already see enough evidence of that. There would be an impact on agriculture. And now there's growing evidence that crops like wheat, maize, and rice are being affected by climate change, largely because it's leading to a reduction in yields. Yes, with higher concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, there's also a fertilization effect. But the net effect is most likely going to be negative. So it is important for us to see that the impacts of climate change can be arrested, can be reduced or avoided. And how do we do that? Well, we have to start limiting the emissions of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And if we were to do that, there are plenty of opportunities by which we can reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. We can use energy more efficiently. We can make sure that deforestation is stopped, that we have much more afforestation, that agriculture, which also leads to greenhouse gas emissions, moves to crops that are much better in terms of reducing emissions of greenhouse gases, agricultural practices by which emissions can be reduced. Industry can become more efficient in the use of energy. Transport can become more efficient. Public transport is one opportunity. More efficient cars, more efficient vehicles are possible. And we can also construct buildings which are far more efficient in the use of energy without sacrificing comfort. So there are lots of opportunities by which the world can move to a low carbon future by mitigating emissions of greenhouse gases. And there are huge co-benefits by doing that. And these are co-benefits that include much greater energy security, lower levels of pollution at the local level, protection of ecosystems, and possibly even greater employment opportunities. So if you look at the cost of inaction, that can be very, very high, because the impacts of climate change will become progressively more serious if we don't do anything about the problem. And the cost of action is actually very low, because there are co-benefits from mitigation. Also, the actual cost of mitigation, we have estimated to reduce emissions in such a way that temperature increase does not exceed 2 degrees Celsius. The cost will be 0.06% of the GDP globally every year. And that amounts to a reduction in consumption of the world by 1.7% in the year 2030. And that's not a high cost at all, because the benefits you're getting from that kind of action are enormous. You're going to be able to avoid some of the worst impacts of climate change, and you would get some huge co-benefits from mitigation. So I think the agenda is very clear, and I would hope that in Lima, Peru, when the COP takes place, the negotiators understand the science of climate change, and they understand the fact that the world cannot continue on business as usual. We have to bring about a change, and to bring about that change is not expensive. In fact, we would be able to produce a much better future for our children and their children, and a much better world and a cleaner world. So I think I would request all those who are listening to this message to go to the IPCC website and study the reports of the IPCC. This is the work of thousands of scientists from all over the world, the best scientists that we can get. And they have worked in a transparent and open manner for the last 4 years plus, and therefore what they have produced is something that I hope the world will understand and the world will listen to.